Hey guys, my hope and prayer is that this message that you're about to watch is a resource that God uses to just bless you and draw you closer in your walk with Him. I also hope that you will use this resource in conjunction with you belonging to a local church and that you won't let it replace your involvement in that church. Again, I really hope that you enjoy this message, and I hope that God uses it to grow you and strengthen you in your love for Jesus Christ.
Give me just like 2 minutes. One of the things that I look forward to on Labor Day weekend is the Labor Day part of it, but it's also, I'm a big college football fan. How many of you watched a college football game yesterday? At least one, all right? So, all right, I'll just go ahead and ask this because I don't know why this is the case, but there is an accumulation of Alabama fans here. Raise your hand. Okay, there it is. All right. So we've just been waiting and everything with college football. Here's what's crazy. Over Labor Day weekend, and it's unlike this in any other weekend of the year, it's an explosion. Like there's no football, no football, no football. And then over Labor Day weekend, you get Thursday night, all day Saturday, Sunday night, and Monday as well. Right? It's like nothing, waiting, explosion. Now, here's why I bring that up. Because as we are in this, what we've called the gospel according to Moses, it is an explosion today that we're going to look at. For the most part, what we're doing is we're taking a look at the life of Moses, if you're new here. We're taking a look at the life of Moses. But if you take a look at the life and ministry of Jesus, they line up so much. And it wasn't like Jesus was trying to imitate Moses. Because Moses was this foreshadowing of what would be so much better than him. And Jesus is absolutely that. He's so much better than what Moses brought. But Moses gives us a taste of what the ministry of Jesus is going to look like. Well, we looked at so far in the life of Moses. And if you are new, I would strongly encourage you to go back to the website, cccamden.com, and just look at previous sermons as we've kind of introduced. Here's what we've looked at. A lot of waiting. All right, we've seen that, Moses was born in this wretched time. God, in this divine plan, rescued him from genocide and planted him in the palace. In the palace. Go ahead, give me the handheld. There's something about me with these mics, all right? I'm just going to be ready to hold a mic when we come here, all right? It's all me, user error. All right. Are we good? There it is. All right. Moses is in the palace for 40 years. And then he ends up having to leave by his own choice. And then he spends 40 years in a place called Midian. He ran for his life, 40 years in Midian. And God is doing all of this to shape him. He learned leadership in a lot of ways while he's in the palace. I mean, his step-grandfather is the leader of the land. Moses learned leadership, but God didn't want just a leader. What God wanted was a shepherd. And so 40 years in the pastures, becoming a shepherd until we get to where we're going to be today. Now, let me just throw this out. We're going to cover quite a bit, and I'm going to go verse by verse through a lot of it, and it is a lot, all right? There are principles here that I think are for you and I. We do a thing that we call on-ramps. An on-ramp is, in highway terminology, is how you get on the highway. For us, when we think about messages for us, we talk about on-ramps, meaning, hey, how do you connect to this? Why do I need to listen to this? Why is this important for you and I? And there's a lot of this because the whole story of Moses is a story about bondage and delivery. And you don't have to raise your hand, but all of us experience bondage. It might be, it might be circumstances that you are in, that I've been in, circumstances that I'm currently in, that really need to change, but it just feels like these things, it just doesn't change. Or it might be a relationship, that there's like this pattern in a relationship. Here's what ends up happening, and then we end up doing this, and it goes south, and then we kind of cycle through, and then there it is again. It happens again. There's certain things that trigger, or it might be an addiction, right? Here's what an addiction looks like then. Man, I swear I'm not going to do it again. I promise I'm not doing it again. But then something happens, some circumstance thing, some whatever, and it triggers me, and it's just like this. So we feel bondage. The story of Moses is a story of deliverance from bondage. And I want to share this with you before we dig deep in here. If you want to go there, Exodus, second book of the Bible, chapter 3 is where we're going to land. But I want to just say this. I will not make false promises to you. You can find all kind of pastors, teachers that will tell you that every circumstance that you're in that is a bondage kind of a thing, God wants to free you from that circumstance. My promise to you is not that the circumstances will change, because I can't make that promise. Like, there's all kind of cool, amazing, biblical, true stories that happened where God delivered people. But you know what? Not every boy that faced a giant in battle won. All right? Not every time that Israel went into battle and there was these fortified walls and they screamed real loud did the walls fall down. I can't make promises that your circumstances are going to change. If you're in a situation where it's a meaningful relationship to you, but there's just some toxic stuff in it, and it's become fractured, I can't promise you that there will be reconciliation. Even if you do everything that God wants you to do, I can't promise that. Because, one, you're smart enough to know that's just not true. I can promise that what Jesus brings us is not circumstantial freedom, but he gives us freedom that's way deeper than that. And I think what my hope is, as we walk through some of these principles, you're going to be able to land on some things of, oh, I needed to hear that. Now, I'll also say this, that we're going to fly through some stuff, and there would likely be some things that we're going to talk about that you might think, man, I wish we'd have spent a little more time talking about that. And if you see me afterwards, or you sent me an email or a text and you said, I wish you would have spent more time talking about, I would say to you, me too. Right? So what I would encourage is, as I walk through some of this, there's going to be some of this that you're going to go, I need to take a little more time on this. Exodus chapter 3 and 4, camp there for a while. All right? Exodus 3, verse 1. Let's start. Now Moses, we've looked at this actually last week. Moses was pasturing the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. All right? He's fled from Egypt. He's out doing nothing. He led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Moses has been shepherding for the better part of 40 years. What's interesting, where he is Horeb, the mountain of God. All right, now it's kind of eerie. If you look at biblical history, the things that happen on Mount Horeb, it's almost like it's a hot spot for God activity, but not prior to this. Like, Moses didn't know all this. Let me give you some of the things through the Old Testament that happened on Mount Horeb. All right, it's also called Mount Sinai. All right, one is we're going to see this burning bush incident that we're about to read about. Okay, that happens there. Several years later, the people of God get to Mount Horeb after they've left Egypt, and God gives Moses the Ten Commandments and all of the law on Mount Horeb. Flash forward several centuries, a man by the name of Elijah, who's a prophet of God, flees. He's running for his life from this evil queen of Israel, whose name is Jezebel, and he's running for his life, and he camps on Mount Horeb, and God visits him there and speaks to him in this whisper. Then several years later in Elijah's life, God visits him again and gives him this vision of who's going to replace him. There's all this kind of, it's like this hotbed of activity. But again, Moses knew nothing about that. You know why? Because it hadn't happened yet. Like, it wasn't called the mountain of God yet. In fact, you know what Horeb means? It means desert desolation. This is nowhere land. Nothing special here. So, but we're going to see something that's incredible. It changes the history, literally, of the world. When it happens on the west side of the wilderness. Here's the point for us. Nothing is wilderness to God. All right? There's nothing that in God's eyes is, oh, that's a desert wasteland. What you might be walking through right now feels like a wasteland. There's nothing that is wilderness to God. You know what Moses was doing? He's just doing what he was supposed to be doing on an average day that looked like every other day. So if it's in a relationship that you find yourself in that's just, man, it's just not going well, just do what God's asking you to do. I can't promise you that he's going to change circumstances like he does for Moses here. But no place is a wilderness to God. You will, and I think most of you would agree with this, you'd line up with this, that some of the things that God did in your life, it wasn't in spectacular moments. You're just doing what you're supposed to be doing. So do what you're supposed to be doing. Nothing's a wilderness to God. Verse 2 and 3. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him, right, to Moses, in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. Now, let me start with this in the angel of the Lord. All right, it's not insignificant here. The article before angel of the Lord is not an angel of the Lord. It was the angel of the Lord. Angel is when you and I read angel, we think, oh, angelic. All right, like, you know, however you envision angels, that created beings. But the word angel really is translated messenger. The messenger of the Lord appeared to Moses in a blazing fire. Who's the messenger of the Lord? I mean, not a messenger of the Lord, the messenger of the Lord. Who is that? That's Jesus. Right? And you could say, oh, that's a stretch. So you're saying that Jesus was in the burning bush. I'm saying that Jesus is in the burning bush. And it's not a stretch to say that, because if you look in the next verse, we're not going to go there yet, but it says, God called to him from the midst of the bush. And I really do feel like this is Jesus entering into this picture right here, speaking to Jesus, he existed long before Bethlehem. He's pre-eternal, all right? The burning bush. How long did it take? You just got to use your imagination a little bit. Moses is walking by, he sees this bush, it's on fire, and he just sees it, and then he's going to walk on. But he doesn't do that. So he takes a look at the bush. How long does it take for Moses to recognize that the bush is not burning, it's not consumed? Or you don't just look and in a heartbeat know, right? It takes a while because it takes a while for a fire to consume a bush. So Moses is staring at it for a little bit, and he notices this interesting trait that the bush is not being consumed. Here's what I find this a little bit fascinating. So our oldest daughter, Marin, just turned 7. Caleb, it's Caleb's daughter, oldest. Caleb, they were talking about Moses in the burning bush. And she said, oh, Dad, I mean, Caleb asked her, what do you know about Moses? And well, you know, he saw this bush and it was burning up, but it wasn't being destroyed. Like, even this is a detail of the story that we kind of take note of, that the bush wasn't consumed. What's that mean? What does it mean that the bush wasn't consumed? And I've heard a variety of different things with it, but because it's not really explained why the bush wasn't consumed. Right, it's on fire, but it's not being destroyed. What's all that? And I read this, and I think I like this. Some people think that it signifies that God's people are the bush, and the fire is the destruction that's happening, but the destruction doesn't destroy them. Right? God's people for 400 years are slaves in Egypt, but they weren't destroyed. Right? As a people, they weren't annihilated. They weren't, right? I hate what's going on in the Middle East right now. I grieve for loss of life that's going on there. You know what I'm not worried about? The people of Israel being destroyed. I mean, I hate all that's happening there, right? But God has this way of preserving his people. Check this out. This is the Apostle Paul, a millennia later, writing this, 2 Corinthians 4, verses 7 to 9. We have this treasure in earthen containers so that the extraordinary greatness of the power of God will be of God and not from ourselves. And here's what he says. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. There's a burning bush, but we're not consumed. We're perplexed, but not despairing. There's a burning bush, but we're not consumed. We're persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. There's a burn. Like here's the point. God's power endures in us, even in affliction. Like, before the first word comes from the burning bush, there's already a message here. And Moses takes a look, and he stares, and he sees this fire, but no destruction happening. There's a message here before God says anything. Verses 4 and 5. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush. Let me just pause real quick, because I thought about this when I was kind of walking back through this. God spoke when Moses paused and turned aside to look. Now, that detail does not have to be in there. It could just say, God, that Moses saw, hey, why is the bush not burned up? It could have just said, and so God spoke to him from the bush, but it doesn't say that. We get this added detail. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look. In other words, like God doesn't speak to you till you're ready to be spoken to. So if there's things in your life that just like, hey, look, you have an addiction, and here's what you need to do to get out of it, and you and I say, I'm not ready for that yet, well, then God wouldn't have said it to you yet. Hey, here's a problem with a relationship that I'm in, and I really feel like this needs to happen, it needs to change, but I feel like God's leading me to do this, and I'm not comfortable doing this, well, then God wouldn't have said it to you had you not been, right? God speaks when we're ready, all right? So, here's what he says. He said, Moses. I'll pause real quick. He doesn't say, psst, hey. It's very personal. And if I'm Moses, I'm sitting there and I think I hear a word from a bush saying something, but when I hear, hey, Mark, right? I'm like, oh, okay, this is for me. Moses. And he said, here I am. Moses says, here I am. Then God said, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Now, look, Moses had never heard God speak before. In fact, it had been almost 80 years since Moses had been in an environment where God, the God of Israel, was even talked about. Because he spent 40 years in the palace, he spent another 40 years wandering around in the pasture. It's not like Moses just hears some voice. Moses didn't know if, this might be a divine thing. This might be a God speaking to me. Moses didn't know of people that God had spoken to. It certainly hadn't happened to him. And he calls Moses by name. He gets personal. And then he says this thing, hey, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Wait a minute. This is a mountain that's called desert and desolate. And this voice says, oh, no, this isn't just brush land. This isn't just pasture land where sheep go and nibble on stuff and then wander. No, this is holy ground. What in the world would make that place that's very unspectacular holy ground? Here's what makes things holy ground. Because God's there. If you flash forward, it's just such a common place, all right? Moses had spent 40 years looking at places like this. And now all of a sudden it's holy ground. If you flash forward 40 years later, the man who replaces Moses after all the things that we're going to talk about in the series are done is a man by the name of Joshua. Joshua leads the people into the promised land, and the night before the first battle they have to face, Joshua's just walking around, just viewing this city that's fortified, and he's wandering around, and he runs into a man, which is really an angel. And it's the captain of the army of the Lord. Check this out, all right? So in Joshua chapter 5, verse 15, the captain of the Lord's army, this is nighttime, on the battlefield, said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. It's the exact wording. So to Moses, it's just on pasture land. It's nothing special about this place. To Joshua, it's on battleground. Here's my point. Don't confuse the common or the difficult with where God is working. God works in the common. God works in the difficult. We too walk on holy ground. What made the ground that Moses walked on holy? What made the ground that Joshua was on holy? Because God was there. Yeah, but I don't know if God's where. We walk on holy ground. Here's why I say that. Because when I asked Jesus, as a follower of Jesus, to enter into my life, he literally entered my life. So when I walk into a gym on a Sunday morning, this is holy ground. But when I go to my bedroom, that's holy ground. Everywhere I travel, it's holy ground. So it doesn't matter where you are, you're in a wilderness in your life, you're in a battlefield in your life, you're in a schoolroom, you're at a party, you're at work, you're on the internet, it's holy ground. And so the messenger of the Lord, Jesus says to him, take your sandals off. What's he saying? Tread lightly. Tread lightly. Because God is here. Verse 6. He also, Jesus, messenger of the Lord, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. I'll address that in just a second. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Good for Moses. All right, this is like, oh, I'm gonna back off a little bit. I was wandering around the house yesterday, and I just put College Game Day on because I love listening. They're just talking football, but they showed this scene at it was just during practice, not on the field, but they were like, and as teams do this, they get in a little mini amphitheater and they have somebody come speak to them. But they had a guy who was an illusionist, all right? And they brought him in, and he was unbelievable. I was intrigued by what he did. I'm watching, I'm thinking, how in the world did he do that? So he did this one thing where, he gets two guys, they come down, and he and the two players, they put their hands together, and he goes, okay, on three, and he looks at one of them, he goes, on three, I want you to think of one word to describe the season. I mean, I don't know, just any word that you can think of that to describe what would make this season incredible. And so they go, 1, 2, 3, and the guy on the right, he yells out this word. And he says, I don't know you, right? He goes, no, we didn't talk about this. No, we didn't. And you look at the other guys, hands are all together. You look at the guy, he says, all right, everybody take your hands out, and I want you to lift up your left hand. On his left hand was written the name of the word that the guy just screamed. And so he calls the quarterback up, and he says, he gives, the deck of cards thing. Or I want you to pick a card, any card. He picks it, he puts it back in the deck, and he closes the deck up. And he asks the quarterback, all right, hey, what card did you pick? And he said, I picked the Queen of Spades. And he said, would you mind taking your left shoe off? And he takes his left shoe off, and the quarterback's like, And he says, and he lifts up the card, lifts up the quarterback's left shoe that he had on his foot, and he shows everybody all the other players, the Queen of Spades is in his shoe. And the quarterback's like, I can't even look, right? That's it. This is Moses. Like, I can't even so much as open my eyes to see what's going on because he knows something is different. Here's the message for you and I. Hey, you're in the middle of something, you're walking through a difficult time, and here's what I think God says to us. Don't trifle with God. Right? Don't play. All right? Don't trifle with God. Don't think he's not doing anything. Right? Verse 7 to 9. And the Lord said, I've certainly seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I've given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians. File that away. I've come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite. And now, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I've seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. We don't know if Moses had this burning passion in him and this deep burden for his people, the Hebrews. I mean, Moses was a Hebrew. He grew up in the palace, but he was a Hebrew. His people were slaves. We don't know if Moses had this yearning, this has to stop, this has to end. His parents are dead by this point. He's 80 years old. But he's got a brother and sister, older brother and older sister, that are both alive. I don't know if he knew that. But it's safe to assume that Moses had this thought, my people, what's going on to my people? Now, he's a long way from there. It's a lifetime ago. But I think let's just assume that it mattered to Moses. And there were times for 40 years of shepherding sheep. You know what you do when you're shepherding sheep? You think a lot, right? It's not like he's got a lot of things to worry about. He's just following sheep around. And you end up with a lot of thinking, and I bet that with regularity thought about the people of Israel. But I also bet that he didn't think about it as much as he used to. Here's what I think we can learn from this. Those promises that we forget, God remembers. Right? I've certainly seen the oppression of my people. Hey, Moses, these are my people. They're not just your people. They're my people. 40 years that Moses was wandering in the wilderness. You know, here's how long that is for God. It's a blink. 40 years, boom. 400 years that they've been slaves in Israel. You know how long that is for God? That's still just one blink. It's not just that God remembers. God is as passionate today, all right? Here's what's kind of crazy. Like I've had a relationship with Jesus for 46 years. And it's a blink to God. When I gave my life to Jesus as a sophomore in high school, I did it with everything in me. Now, I had a lot of growth to do. Still do. But the passion that I had when I gave my life to Jesus has kind of risen, fallen. But the passion that God had when I gave my life to Jesus, and He cared deeply, has not waned at all. God, those things that we forget or they wane in passion, God remembers. Philippians 1:6, for I'm confident of this very thing, that He who began a good work in you, right, and He did for me as a sophomore in high school, will complete it. Why? Because He still feels as passionate about my spiritual freedom as He did way back then. I love that God said He'd come down. All right? So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians. Those are action words, all right? Hey, I'm showing up, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Those are words of action. My bet is that Moses is thinking, well, finally. Right? I've spent 40 years in the palace. I've spent 40 years in the pasture. I'm tired. I'm sick of waiting about it. My people, those people, 400 years in slavery. I'm tired of it. God said He's going to come down. I'm fired up now until we see verse 10. Therefore, I'm coming down. I'm going to do business. Therefore, come now, and I'll send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Oh, shoot. Right? I want freedom. I want God's people to have freedom, but now it's going to be on me. And isn't that just like you and I? Like, I want my relationships to be great until God says, yeah, and by the way, it's going to start, Mark, with you. I want circumstances to turn out fantastic. I want to be outside of, there's financial burdens, and I feel enslaved by my financial situation. Well, that's fine, Mark. It's going to start with you. We're all great with God doing things. Here's the principle. We pray for God to move, and He might do it through us. Not always, right? It's not always got to start with you, but sometimes God's going to say, yep, I want that relationship to get solved, and you're going to be the one to start the process. We pray for God to move. He might do it through us. So we do what Moses did for the rest of chapter 3 and the bulk of chapter 4, and that is a ton of excuses. I'm not going to read all this for us, but let me just walk through. I'll summarize Moses' excuses. Oh, I care for my people. I care about your people more than you care about your people. Go, Moses. Right? And so he gives all these excuses, and here we are. Verses 3 to 12, Moses said, well, who am I? And God says, it really doesn't matter who you are. I'll be with you. All right? It's right? Who cares who you are, Moses? I know you haven't been there in 40 years. This is a lifetime ago for you, and you've moved away, and you haven't seen those people in 40 years. It doesn't matter who you are. I'll be with you. So Moses, in verses 13 to 22, Moses asked the logical question. Okay, you'll be with me? Well, who are you? Or who am I going to tell them to sent me, because I don't know who you are? And God says, I am who I am. That's Yahweh is the Hebrew writing of that. I love that, because it's in contrast to what Moses in Egyptian culture, which is what he was raised in, would have heard. Who are you? Well, I'm the God of the Nile River. Well, I'm the God of the sun. Well, I'm the God of the cattle. I'm a God of the you name it. I'm the God of the fish. I'm the God of the soil. I'm the God of the rain. I'm the God of the moon. I'm the God of, and God says, I am who I am. And it's like a mic drop. Boom. You don't need anything more than this. I am who I am. I do what I do. I'll be who I'll be. Like, I don't answer to anybody. This is we've used this word regularly, sovereignty. I'm in charge. That's what this is. I am who I am. And you can't change me.
And so he says, and Moses says, who are you? God says, I am who I am. I'm the God of your covenant fathers. I'm the God of the people before you and before them and before them and before them. And I made promises to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that I haven't forgotten my promises. All right? Tell them that I hear them. And then God tells Moses, and here's what's going to happen. I want to send you down there, and here's what's going to happen. Moses says in chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, yeah, but what if they don't buy it? What if I go there and I say, well, Yahweh sent me. I'm sorry, who? Yahweh sent me, and they don't believe that you sent me. And so God says, well, check out these miracles. And so there's three things that happened real quick. Two of them happened in Moses' face, and then one of them is said, well, I'll do this if need be. One is, God tells Moses, you may remember this, God tells Moses, hey, that walking stick that you're so familiar with, you know every little, right? Because you've used this for years upon years upon years. You know everything about it. It's nothing but a stick. Throw it down on the ground. Moses throws it down on the ground, and it becomes a snake. And Moses does what I would do. He's terrified of the snake. Like, I hate snakes, all right? Moses puts it down, it becomes a snake, and God says, you see that? Now pick it up. By its tail, right? So Moses picks it up by its tail, it becomes a snake again. Becomes a stick again. And God says, they'll believe you. And then God says, now take your hand and put it inside your cloak. So Moses takes his hand, sticks it inside whatever the cloak was, all right? And then he says, pull it out, and pulls it out, and it's leprous. It's leprosy. It's like white like snow. And Moses is like, ooh, I better listen, right? Like this is now it's very personal. He's got a diseased hand that would rot off and then spread to the rest of his body. And God says, all right, put it back in. All right, pull it back out, and it's clean as can be. Okay, God means business. And then God says, and if they don't believe those two things, then I'll have you pour water out on the ground and it'll become blood. All right, check out these miracles. Hey, they'll believe you. All right, all right, if they don't buy it, check out these miracles. They'll believe you. And here's what God's saying. Look, you just do what I'm asking you to do. I'll take care of the results. Just do it, right? And that's for you and me and our little things that we're in bondage to. Just do what God's asking you to do, and he'll take care of the results. Moses in verses 10 to 12 said, but I stutter. Like I don't speak well, which is really interesting because if you'll remember this, you know how Moses was described when he was being brought up in the palace in Pharaoh's household? He was a man powerful in words and deeds. He could speak fine. He's fishing right now. I don't speak well. Well, maybe he didn't speak as well as he used to because he spent 40 years talking to sheep, right? I don't speak well. God's answer to that is, hey, who made that mouth of yours? Here's what God's saying. Nothing in this is out of my domain. Like nothing in all of what we're going to read about that happens, and next week is going to be a full dose of this. I'm in charge. This is what God is saying. Verse 13 to 17, Moses says, please, can you just please send somebody other than me? Like, please. I don't speak that well. I'd really rather not do this. Can you send anybody else but me? And so God says, all right, I'll let your brother will be fine as a spokesperson. But God's kind of angry with it. So I wrote it this way. God's like, ugh, all right, your brother will do the job. And I think what would have this looked like had Moses just answered yes from the get-go? I don't know. But Aaron is plan B of what God wanted to happen. It just is. So I don't know exactly what would have happened. And finally, Moses is saying, okay, I'll do it. And then in verse 18 to 23, Moses is done with his excuses. And God basically says, all right, good. Now that we've got all that settled, just go. Just go. So here's what I want to do. I just want to wrap with what do I do if I'm that person who's found myself in some kind of bondage? It might be my own doing. It might be the circumstances that were handed to me. It was the hand that I was dealt, whatever it is. But I find myself in some kind of a circumstance I wish was different, and I just feel like God has given up, and this is just kind of what I got to live with the rest of my life. Again, I'm not going to promise you that your circumstances are going to change. I can't do that. It's false. It gives false hope. And frankly, it's just dangerous because when you've been promised your circumstances will change and they don't change, that causes some problems. I'm not going to promise you your circumstances are going to change. I am going to promise that God has freedom for us. And that's in this interior, hey, I can battle through this. So here's the summary of God's answers to the solutions. One is this. God says to you and I'll be with you. I'll be with you. I talked with a couple about 3 weeks ago who, in the process of adoption, and they were a week away, and the birth mother pulled the plug on it. It's called a discontinued adoption, which is just the kindest words that can be put to it, because they were wrecked. They'd already had a baby shower, they had monogram clothes, they had all this kind of stuff that had already been planned because it was promised. They had a relationship with the mother that they had built, etc. And the mother said, I'm going to keep the girl. And one of the things I went over and I just talked with them and prayed with them. One of the things and they just resonated with is, look, I'd rather walk through darkness with God than a sunny day without Him. And what they will learn in this process is that God's with them. And so what God says to you and I in the midst of the worst that we walk through is, I'll be with you. I'll be with you. He also says this, I'm not restricted by anything. Now, again, I can't promise you that means He's going to unleash all of His power to change your circumstances. What He might do is to unleash all of His power to change your heart and give you strength and endurance in the midst of your circumstances. But God says, I'm restricted by nothing. God also says, hey, look, I'll make my freedom happen. Now, God's freedom might look different than what you and I want it to be. But God's freedom is always better than what my plans are. And God says, I'll make my freedom happen. It might be that you have to take the first move. It might be that God, just like He did with Moses from the burning bush, and says, now I'm going to take you to Egypt. And it might be that God in your bondage says to you, and I'm going to have you take the first step. But God says, I will make my freedom happen. And then lastly, I think He says to you and I just what He says to Moses at the end, just go. Trust me and go. Trust me and go. I don't know where that sits with you. I'm going to pray for us in a minute. And I would encourage you, if any of this kind of resonates with you and like, I need to land a little more on this, go back and just on your own. Look, God speaks to you as you open up His Word. Just your own, look back through Exodus 3 and 4. All right? If it would be helpful for you, you struck a chord. This is hitting me in a spot, and I'd like to talk. I'd be more than glad to hang around and do that as well. Michael would love to do that, just to kind of connect with you and help you walk this. Hey, I need some freedom from the bondage that I'm in. All right,